Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us here tonight, and thank you all for coming out tonight on Budget Day, which is a highly exciting day for everybody. Yeah, and I think this is a fascinating topic. Brexit is so in the headlines at the moment. Our news cycle, our political circles are dominated by Brexit. It's quite interesting just having some space to talk about something other than Brexit in the budget today. I often describe our politics as being trapped in a Brexistential crisis right now because Brexit does suck up all the oxygen. But one of the things that is very, very interesting is where does race and BAME communities and policies like immigration play out in the Brexit debate. And there's been, there's a bit of an assumption about, and I think in politics, a lazy assumption about even just the blocking, the lumping together of very, very different and very diverse communities in this lump, BAME, because we will all know from our own experiences, different communities, different parts of the country, different economic stratas have got very different views about what they want from their politics and society and indeed Brexit. So the question is often asked, there is an assumption that the BAME community are overwhelmingly Remain, and in some ways the statistics do point to that. Lord Ashcroft's referendum day poll concluded that BAME voters backed Remain by 68% to 31%, so that does seem like a very, very big amount. However, the BAME turnout was significantly lower compared to white voters, 57% compared to 74% with white voters. And certainly when I was campaigning during the EU referendum campaign, there was a lot of campaigners on the Leave side who were very, very ardently wanting for the Britain to leave the EU, to change its laws on immigration. So I hope we can sort of dig a little bit deeper tonight with our panel and also with you about what you want out of Brexit, why you think we got the result we did, what do you think are the kind of hopes and even aspirations for your communities in terms of Brexit. So we have an illustrious panel here. I'm delighted to be joined by Nima Begum, who is a political scientist at the University of Manchester, and she's a research associate at the Centre of the Dynamics of Ethnicity, and she wrote a PhD thesis on race and identity in voting in the 2016 EU referendum. Perfect timing. Rupa, take a seat. Very good. So we're delighted to have, I think your work will be very, very germane to this. We have Sundar Katwala, who is the director of British Future, a think tank that focuses on issues of identity, migration and opportunity. He was the General Secretary of the Fabian Society from 2003 to 2011, and he's an illustrious writer and commentator, and generally somebody who you can always go to for sort of calm and authoritative commentary on some of these very big issues of the day. So delighted to have him here. To my right, naturally, is Trevor Phillips. That's a joke we do ourselves, it's fine. He was going to be on the far right, it's fine. So Trevor, as we know, is a very, very well-respected leading writer, broadcaster and executive. Trevor and I got to know each other when he was head of the Commission for Racial Equality, and he then became chairman of its successor, the new Equalities and Human Rights Commission, from 2006 to 2012. So a leading figure in debate about politics and race relations in this country. And he also was on the board of, I believe it was the Remain campaign, so it's his fault, basically. We can all blame him. And then finally, delighted to have Rupa Huq, who is the MP for Ealing Central and Acton, first elected in 2015. Rupa was previously an academic, a lecturer in sociology and criminology. She also has a hinterland in Europe, working for the European Parliament for the Labour Party, and is a leading advocate for the people's vote. So a really, really excellent panel who will hopefully dig into some of the details. And Nima, I'm going to ask you to start. We're going to hear sort of 5 minutes from our panellists about their assessment of why we've got here today and what the future holds.
Okay, thank you, Aisha. Thanks to Rob and Tim for inviting me to speak here today. I'm actually just recovering from the flu, so please bear with me this evening. So my PhD is on motivations for supporting Leave or Remain amongst ethnic minority voters. So in the past couple of years, I've been crunching the numbers, and I've also done interviews and focus groups with Remain and Leave voters of different ethnic backgrounds. So since the surprise referendum result in 2016, we've had various explanations put forward on why people voted the way they did. There was a significant generation gap, there's a big education gap, and a values gap. But there was also a significant ethnic gap in that white voters were much more likely to vote Leave than ethnic minorities, who overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU. So we know that ethnic minority voting patterns are similar to that of the general population. So we saw that young ethnic minority voters, those who were in professional occupations, those who were degree educated, and those who'd been able to take more advantage of EU membership, such as travelling and working in other EU countries, were a lot more likely to support remaining in the EU. But there were some key issues that played out differently amongst ethnic minority voters. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to talk about 3 key issues for ethnic minority voters. So the first is racism and xenophobia, secondly, immigration, and finally, identity. So the majority of the ethnic minority voters that I spoke to were largely ambivalent towards the EU. There wasn't really a lot of enthusiasm about the European Union. But what drove support for Remain for a lot of ethnic minorities was what they perceived as racism and xenophobia on the Leave side, particularly the Breaking Point poster unveiled by Farage was really off-putting for ethnic minority voters, and a lot of people felt that the discourse on immigration was and talk about controlling borders was directed towards ethnic minorities in Britain, whether or not they were British-born. So at the same time, there were ethnic minority voters who thought of the EU itself as a racist institution and saw its economic policies, such as agricultural subsidies, putting outside economies at a disadvantage. And they also referred to the way that the EU handled the refugee crisis, which saw thousands of refugees and migrants drowning in the Mediterranean. So for many ethnic minority voters, Europe was a fortress which allowed freedom of movement for white migrants while keeping out non-whites. There were also a lot of people who felt that continental Europe is a lot more racist than Britain and feel that the UK is a lot more tolerant. And I also spoke to a group of Muslim female voters who felt that Europe is a lot more Islamophobic than the UK, pointing to the bikini ban and the hijab ban and the policing of female Muslim bodies on the continent. So the second issue I'm going to talk about is immigration. While many ethnic minorities felt that they were being targeted by the anti-immigration discourses around the Leave campaigns, there were ethnic minority Leave voters who wanted to see controls on immigration, and they particularly bought into the stigmatization of Eastern Europeans and reinforced some of the tropes about Eastern Europeans as taking jobs, having high levels of criminality, and fraudulently claiming benefits. So they appear to reinforce similar forms of racism and xenophobia that they or their parents or grandparents would have faced when they first arrived in the UK, and what we in many ways continue to face. However, the official Leave campaign, were quite strategic in trying to appeal to ethnic minority voters that stopping migration from Europe would allow more migration from the Commonwealth, and that it was unfair that anyone from within the EU could come and live and work in the UK, whereas those who are outside the EU face a lot more barriers. So this leads me on to the final issue, which is that of Britishness and identity. The Remain campaign tried to appeal to the idea of a shared Europeanness and the idea of a European family, which had even less appeal for ethnic minorities who saw this as more of an exclusive white identity and identified more strongly as British as opposed to European. So groups such as Africans for Britain and Muslims for Britain formed during the campaign, and they campaigned on this idea of Britishness, and they talked about the contribution of Commonwealth citizens, for example, in fighting alongside Britain against some of its European neighbours and helping to rebuild the country after the war. So they argued it was unfair that European citizens had much easier entry into the UK and that trade with the Commonwealth was being restricted by EU trade rules. The Bangladeshi Caterers Association wrote a letter of support for the official Leave campaign as they felt that the unfair immigration rules was leading to curry houses having to be shut down due to staff shortages because they couldn't get the staff that they needed from Bangladesh or elsewhere, whereas French and Italian restaurants can much more easily recruit the staff that they need from within Europe. So that was a very brief overview of ethnic minority motivations for supporting Leave or Remain, which, as you could probably tell, were very multi-layered and complex, especially when it came to race and identity. So I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing from the other panellists. Thank you.
Fascinating. Trevor, I'll turn to you next.
Thank you very much, Aish, and thank you very much, Robert, for inviting me. I should just, by the way, say I haven't been on the QMC campus for 35 or maybe 40 years. I think last time I was here, I was occupying it as a student. And I have to say, yeah, thank you. I have to say, forgive me my French, it was an absolute shithole then, but it has become such a spanking new place. I congratulate you on how you managed to do that. It looks like a great university. You know, if I were less than 100 years old, I might even come here myself. Now, on the issue of Brexit, let me start by putting my own view in context. As Aisha says, you can't really get any space in political debate at the moment for Brexit. And I will simply preface my remarks by saying I basically don't agree with this. I think Brexit is actually one of the less important things that faces our country. I was until the summer the president of the John Lewis Partnership, which is the second largest private company in this country. It is one of our big retailers. It is, I think, still the most successful retailer. But everybody knows, you can see it every night in the news, that we are absolutely being caned in the retail sector. It is the most competitive territory. But it's actually not competition from discounters that we really worry about every day. The 85,000 people who work for John Lewis get up and think about. What they get up and think about is technology. In 3 years' time, it is very likely that there will be no cashiers in our stores. And that means that something like a third of our people are going to not lose their job, but they're going to have to do something very different. The impact of that completely outweighs any conceivable impact in relation to Brexit. And I would say the same thing, by the way, is true about the second big thing that is affecting us, which is a bit more difficult to describe briefly, so I won't try, and that is changing demography. Both age, ethnicity, location, geography. These things are extraordinary, secular, and the technology, by the way, is a one-off trend which will have more impact on our lives than anything since the coming of the railways. Brexit, by comparison, is basically a storm in a teacup. So, having said that, let me deal with this important question. Aisha referred to the Ashcroft, Lord Ashcroft's data. Now, okay, Lord Ashcroft was the deputy chair of the Conservative Party, which is no recommendation for anybody, in my view, but he has become, I think, a pretty good pollster. One of the things that he did after, or his outfit did after the referendum, was to ask people about their attitudes on certain things. And three of them, the three I'm going to mention, were capitalism, multiculturalism, and feminism. The question is, what was most important in people's decision-making? Now, if you followed the campaign, you would think the real argument was about whether we would lose money, whether families would suffer losses in their pockets and so on and so forth. So the issue was the economy, and that is certainly the view that we took on the Remain campaign. Actually, when you asked people what divided them was the following. It was not attitudes towards economy, brackets, capitalism. If you ask people, do you think each of the following as being a force for good or a force for ill, amongst leavers, amongst those who thought it was a force for ill, the nation divided 51-49 leavers, remainers. And those who thought capitalism was a force for good, the nation divided 51-49. There was no difference in view about what is the right form of the economy between remainers and leavers. This is not left-right. If you, however, ask them, is multiculturalism a force for ill or a force for good? Those who thought it was a force for ill divided 4-1 in favour of leave, and those who thought it was a good thing divided more than 2-1 amongst remainers. Completely the reverse view about multiculturalism. And something similar is true about feminism. Leavers divided 3-1 against, remainers 3-2 in favour. So the point I really want to make here is that what drove, I think, the cleavage in the referendum was not views about the economy. And the arguments that we are having even today seem to me still to be making the same mistake, that many people in this country are completely happy to sacrifice what they're told might be some economic disadvantage in return for living in a country in which they will feel comfortable. That doesn't necessarily mean I will feel comfortable or you will feel comfortable, but they have a different view of how we should live our lives. And I think we need to start from that point of view, because when we start to think, what do people of colour respond to, these things become extremely important. On the Remain campaign board, I can tell you all sorts of interesting and scurrilous stories, but
go on.
No. Well, we'll see how we go on with the discussion. But the fundamental issue point that when this question came up, how should we approach minority communities? Two things were decided. First of all, immigration would not be a topic for us to raise. And the view of the Remain campaign was that if we raised the issue of immigration, we would lose. And of course, that's what the pollsters always tell you, that the left will always lose on immigration. I, as it happens, and I should basically, by the way, say, when Aisha says it's my fault, that's exactly what my wife says. She blames me for two things. One is that Sheila's Wheels went bankrupt because I introduced the law that said you had to equate, you couldn't discriminate on gender. It's not my fault, it's just fairness. And secondly, she blames me for Brexit because I lost every single argument on the board. My view was that we should have had an immigration story, and that it was important not just to people of colour or to children, immigrants, but for everybody. And we might conceivably have divided the nation a little bit against us, but I think we absolutely lost because it looked like we had nothing to say about the thing that seemed most important to most people. So the first thing was we didn't have anything to say about immigration, and that was one reason why I think we had difficulty in appealing to minority communities. And secondly, as Nima said very, very accurately, there was a very strong current of opinion that believed that if we left the EU and removed the advantage of labour movement for people from the other 27 countries, it would be to the benefit of people, particularly from the subcontinent. To put it crudely, people in Indian restaurants who could not get chefs in because they couldn't get a visa felt that maybe this was a way to be able to do that. And I tell you, I had this argument many times, and there is a reason why people from minority communities voted in this direction. So the truth is that it wasn't so much that the Remain campaign didn't know what to do about appealing to minority communities. It was that the overall proposition, which is that we would win by telling people that Brexit would destroy their pocketbooks, was just wrong. It was just wrong. And it was wrong for pretty much everybody, black, white, brown. May I just make one, I know I've got to stop, but I'll make a couple of quick points about what happens subsequently. There's been a lot of talk since Brexit about the Brexit vote promoting racial hostility and violence and so on. I can say with absolute certainty, because this was my life for the best part of 10 years, it's nonsense. We may have better reporting and we may be paying more attention, but there is absolutely no evidence that the rate of serious racial assault has gone up. Oh, no. And the other point I want to make about this is a very simple one. Right now, there's an interesting question, this point, again, that Nima made. If we were to ask minority communities now, do you want to join a union where approximately a quarter rather, of the governments have people from the far right who are anti-immigrant in government, and another quarter have very powerful opposition parties for whom 1 in 6 people at least have voted? Would you feel comfortable in that union? And would you feel comfortable in a union which says very simple things, like you may not collect data on an ethnic basis, so you will never be able to establish whether there is an ethnic pay gap in France or Germany or Italy or Sweden or the Netherlands in the way that we can today? And I just put those questions out there. If we were to ask people from minority communities today, do you want to join such a bloc? I'm pretty sure the answer's not going to be yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Trevor. Thank you very much for that. Some challenging thoughts there, and we'll come round and do questions afterwards. So store up the things that you want to put to the panellists. Sundar, I'll come to you next.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. Should I say British Future's a non-partisan think tank? It's a charity. We don't take a political view on Brexit or party politics, but we are interested in engaging the public about conversations we need to have about identity, immigration, integration, with a view that we want this to be a more confident, more inclusive, less polarised, less divided society than it is. In terms of Brexit and race and ethnic minorities, Brexit is probably one of the biggest things that's happened in our country for 50 years. It's not really, as Trevor's just told us, about complicated issues about the economy and trade arrangements. It's about national identity, citizenship, immigration, xenophobia, racism. It's about the stuff that the race debate has been about. And yet, for all that, I think, building on what's been said already, I would not underestimate the indifference of black and Asian Britain to the question of Europe, certainly until we had the vote in 2016. I think you could make the case against that indifference and say it was more important than that. The case for the indifference, I think, that was largely felt among ethnic minority Britain was that the feeling was largely mutual, actually, about indifference about a topic where those engaged with the topic were largely indifferent to these issues. We've got two tribes in the Europe debate that go back, to the 1950s about whether we should join or not, to the 1970s when we had another referendum, long before they became the Remainers and Leavers of 2016. They were arguing, those two sort of tribes of the Europe debate, that this was the existential national question. And if this was the existential national question, they never really managed to find a way to engage black and Asian Britain in this national question. Black and Asian Britain was engaged in another set of existential questions about immigration, multi-ethnic, multi-faith Britain. There was another set of existential questions as well about the four nations, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. The York debate was just on separate tracks from these. And you would have thought, I think, in 2004 and onwards, actually the York debate became much more about red tape and bureaucracy and regulations and much more about immigration. You'd have thought that they'd connect up But actually, by the time we were having the vote, they still hadn't connected up. I think the pro-Europeans would be puzzled by this. They would say, but we're open versus closed. We're the cosmopolitans, we're the pro-immigration people, but we've decided not to talk about it if it comes up. But, that's the side we're on, really. But if I think back, not necessarily about 2016, but sort of EU meetings over, say, 20 years as a sort of think tank, a journalist and so on, I think this is a paradigm case of something you see quite a lot of, which is cosmopolitanism without diversity. I think, they would have wanted you on the board, Trevor, but I think the Remain campaign would have thought we'd love to have lots of more Black and Asian friends. We just need someone to tell us where we go to get some. And I think there was some convening of sort of, the heads of temple associations and things like that, saying, take us to your communities. We need to explain how jolly important this Europe thing was about. And there was a controversy. I think there was a leaflet that went out to London, and it had 20-odd people in it, and they were all white. And so people said, how have you done that? It's London, it's our capital city, it's 45% white British. And they changed the leaflet. They put Benjamin Zephaniah on the leaflet so that ethnic minority London felt it was part of this too. So I think there was a hope, really, that the other side would win it for you. And that was a reasonable bet, actually, because the other side tried hard to win it for them. I mean, if you then think about people like my father-in-law, been waiting for the referendum for 40 years because they were right the first time. One thing those sorts of people might say occasionally would be things like, Enoch was right. Not necessarily about that stuff, immigration. I mean, we've got over that now, and some of them still thought that, but actually sovereignty. He was the patron saint of the Get Out of Europe campaign. And actually Nigel Farage, who was the modern embodiment of the Get Out of Europe campaign, his political hero was Enoch Powell. So Nigel Farage did quite a lot to get the referendum, but a lot of people on the Leave side thought that Nigel Farage is a problem for this 50% claim. There was a big argument. I think there was some sincere moves in UKIP and in Leave to say we've got to tone this down. People like Douglas Carswell converted to UKIP really to try and shut Nigel Farage up and to bury Enoch Powell and not to praise him. And that was sincere from some people. But in the end, the Leave campaign ran two very cynical messages, I think, about immigration. You had MPs who thought the net migration target was right to reduce immigration, running Save the Curry Houses. We'll have more Asian migration. And I think you can't have both of those things. And then you had a scare campaign against Turkey. And the reason that was, I think, cynical was that firstly, it wasn't going to happen, but secondly, that was not the view that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove had of Turkey. They were in favour of Turkey membership, but they ran an immigration scare campaign. So I think ethnic minorities, had to decide how to vote, but I think they were pretty disgruntled at the choice on offer. To some extent, I think ethnic minorities should have been closer to 52% than 30%. I think they're natural Eurosceptics, very strong British identity, very low European identity. Not sure it was worth leaving, not sure they could trust the Leave campaign. So I think there was a sort of disgruntlement about the debate that we'd had. And that's why people chose, probably split about 2-1 for Remain, as we've heard. A lot of people didn't vote. So in the end, up to 2 million ethnic minority votes for Remain, probably up to 1 million for Leave. They were pretty important, those votes. But also the sort of several 100,000 people who didn't go to the polls. We know that the people who didn't vote preferred Remain if they'd voted but didn't vote. The people who didn't vote because they were younger were a much more ethnically diverse group than the people who did. So I think, in some ways the Remain and Leave tribes are much more sort of with us 2 years later than even they were in 2016. But I still think a lot of Black and Asian Britain still doesn't feel they're part of it. The ethnic minority group, the minority group most affected by this was the 3 million Europeans. And we should have sorted that out on day one. And I think it's a great shame we didn't. We think of that group as white other. A third of them are Poles. It's a much more ethnically diverse group than we think. It's actually a more ethnically diverse group than the British born, because a lot of the EU 15 migrants are ethnic minorities from the rest of Europe. There are also a lot of EU nationals from third countries, hundreds of thousands of them actually, and I think there's a group that might just get left out of this debate that we haven't thought about. In terms of what does it mean for race in Britain, maybe not very much. I don't think the debate we had about Windrush, about Stephen Lawrence, about the Race Relations Act, about Enoch Powell, I don't think much of that had to do with Europe. I think you could have a different scorecard if we were looking at gender or the environment or workers' rights. But on race, it wasn't the case. So actually, one of the impacts of Brexit will be to dilute race in the European Union. It'll be to take the ethnic diversity out of Brussels. They won't, for reasons of ideology, count the number of ethnic minority MEPs. They won't give you a figure. They'd do it if it was women. It wouldn't take long to count. There are about 9 of the 70 British MEPs, and there are about 9 of the other 600 MEPs. And some of these countries are as ethnically diverse as Britain. So if you look at Brussels, the civil service and so on, it looks like Westminster and Whitehall of 1988. 1989. It's a very diverse city where race is just not on the agenda at all. So I think that's a shame. What happens here depends what we think was on the ballot paper. If some people thought what was on the ballot paper was, do you want to live in 1972 again? Then it's very, very important to disappoint those people and say everything that's changed since 1972 is here to stay. But we made a debate about 2016 to 2019 that we're now going to leave. So I think we've got to establish what was on the ballot paper. I think we've got to have a debate about what Brexit means. We've got to have a debate about immigration that we still haven't really had in the last 2 years. I think we've got to be vigilant about hate crime, but we should welcome if we're reporting and catching more of it. I think there are 2 things that would be dangerous for race relations in this country, because I think the aftermath has felt that it's about race because it's been a heightened moment of polarisation. I think no deal would be really dangerous. I think there would be a blame game. I think people would blame the Europeans that we're here. It would get mixed up with other forms of heightened moments around Muslims and minorities that have nothing really to do with Europe. So I think no deal would be very dangerous. But I also think, and obviously we'll hear different views about this, I'm sure, tonight, I think a second referendum could be a dangerous moment for social polarisation in this country, because I think we've actually seen an immigration debate that has the potential to calm down, to get on with it, to decide the changes we're going to make. I think we will see a debate that is much more reheated, much more polarised, and we'll see 2 campaigns really campaign in very different places to try and mobilise very different kinds of low engagement voters. I think it would end 51-49 one way or the other, but I think we would end that process more divided and polarised than we began it. So I'm hoping we can find a way through this that doesn't involve reheating and repolarising the debate again.
Well, thanks very much for that, Sandra. Very and very interesting that you raised the second referendum, because that is very much in the zeitgeist at the moment. We just had the big march in London. Just on show of hands, who here would like a second referendum? Interesting. Well, that leads us very seamlessly onto our final speaker, Rupa, because obviously Rupa is a big advocate for the second referendum, and yeah, we'll over to you now, Rupa.
Thanks. I'm going to stand up so you can see me. You probably still can't see me, can you? Right. So I'm an ex-lecturer sort of trapped in an MP's body, or an ex-MP, an MP trapped in a lecturer's body one way or another. And sorry, have we done the show of hands of who voted Leave and Remain? Did I miss that?
Not yet, we haven't done that
I'd be curious to know which way did people... Who voted Remain in this room? Did anyone vote Leave, and are they prepared to admit to it? Okay, so there are some as well.
Good. Do make sure you ask questions afterwards, so we really want to hear from you. So
so look, I mean, occupational hazard of going last, a lot of what you wanted to raise has already come up.
So, carry on.
Okay, is this working?
It is working.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I'll try and fix it for you.
Okay. So I think I'll talk about some personal type stuff, because that's, that's unique to me. So I guess I'm from a generation where instinctively grew up under Thatcherism in the 80s. And sorry, the more I stand up now, I can see there's people in this room I actually know from various things in the past. So I feel I can be honest with you tonight. So look,
it is being recorded, just letting you know. Yes, just
okay. So
I feel like it's good
Real
to disclosure.
Right. Okay. So some quality control comes up. But look, one of my early memories of the EU, I suppose, was the EEC before that, wasn't it? It was the 1984 European election. And that's the first time, I think, Labour overtook the Conservatives in the share of popular vote. And it looked like we might be able to do this and we might actually win an election. And there was a poster that said something, it was Neil Kinnock, sort of, don't let him in by the back door. And to me, that sounded like quite a good idea. And the fact that sort of Thatcher, and I think a lot of voters misunderstood that election as well. And that is what helped Labour edge ahead. And so things like the social chapter, I think there were only 12 EU member states at the time, things like that Thatcher was dead set against. were coming from Europe. Anything good that seemed to be happening in the 80s was coming through the back door from Europe. So instinctively, I've always been pro-European for those reasons. Sort of fast forward to the 90s, and I ended up working for a Labour MEP. And some of the early campaigns I remember, things like tous différents, tous égaux, all different, all equal. I mean, I don't know how far they penetrated here, but it was a big thing in the 90s that the EU was pushing, Council of Europe, similar things. And sort of then fast forward to 2004, I was a European candidate in the European election of that year. In fact, I'm a sort of failed European candidate who went for Westminster instead as a consolation prize. Probably a wise thing, seeing the viability of being an MP is pretty finite nowadays. But I suppose the thing we haven't had really mentioned tonight yet is the word Commonwealth. And seeing as we are dealing with what does Brexit mean for Black and Asian Britain, I think when we were growing up, people of my generation, we were all sort of Black and Asian together. We were all Black, actually. But it was a political definition to some extent. Then it sort of started bifurcating into Asian and Black. And then I think things like the Satanic Verses in 1989, even the riots in Oldham, Bradford and Burnley in 2001, which were a bit different. I mean, the press coverage was saying these are a bit like 1981, like Brixton, Toxteth, those sort of places. Not Exeter, but places with X in the name. Brixton, Toxteth, Moss Side, I think was the other one. By then, I think there were people saying, no, these were not Asian riots. They were Muslim riots. I think the Hindu Daily or something, the whatever newspaper that's called, was saying that these weren't. So sort of, I think we've seen, from when we were all Black together in the 70s to different splits. And when I was a European candidate in 2004, I remember the first Commonwealth schism came up for me, and we've had the curry one mentioned a bit. So I'll mention the bananas one. When I was doing hustings meetings, it was a list election. I was with 9 other people. There were 10 of us. And so always this issue of Commonwealth bananas. We're not trading with the Commonwealth. They are our oldest and strongest partners, and we're ratting on. So I think this is when my antennae first sort of picked up this sort of clash potentially between the two. And then, fast forward to where we are now, and the sort of some of the polling results that show that it was not. I mean, again, we don't know with all these questions. What does Brexit mean for Black and Asian communities? We don't really know how the vote split. So we have sort of different figures from different people. The Runnymede Trust says 3/4 of Black people and 2/3 of Asians voted Remain. This is just polling estimates. It's all guesstimates, isn't it? Ipsos Mori say 29% of Black people voted Leave, which is the smallest of any ethnicity, which is 51.8 on the other side. But they also said the turnout was only 46% amongst BME people, as opposed to 68% amongst white communities. So, I mean, again, if there was to be a second referendum, I think people on the side I'm on should mobilise better if it were to happen. I mean, where did we get in this? How did we get in this mess that we're in now? I mean, 2 years on, more than 2 years on, we're still heading to destination unknown. We haven't got any concrete trade deals. We don't even know. We don't know where this is going at all. We know that the Conservative Party is in complete disarray. That there's potentially up to 80 of their own side that aren't going to vote for their own deal. I think we've said we're not going to vote for it if it doesn't satisfy our 6 tests. The 6 tests are essentially that it replicates everything we've got now. It's a lot more difficult than it looks to disentangle yourself from 40 plus years of being enmeshed with all these other 27 other nation states. And, you can't, well, the clocks went back on Sunday, but you cannot turn the clock back to that sort of era. People who were in middle management then are either retired or dead. It's a lot more hard than it looks. So, all these things that were promised to be really easy, turning out to be bloody difficult things that... So, the sort of discomfort a lot of people had about the centralising tendencies of the EU. And I think, Jeremy Corbyn was criticised for saying only 7.5 out of 10 when he was asked to give a rating to how would he how would he assess the EU? I think that was entirely sensible. If you say 10 out of 10, then you're a bit nuts, because, we all know... Sorry, I'm not qualified to give a diagnosis for the recording of mental illness, obviously, so I exonerate myself from that. But, look, you would be sorely mistaken if you were to say 10 out of 10. We all know about gravy trains and wastage and all those things. my option would have been to stay in and reform. But, I'm kind of spoiled, maybe. My seat is over 70% Remain. And I think the last figures we have are the 2001 census. It's actually 60% white, 40% other things. It will be different now. 2011 was the last census we did, this decennial exercise. But, we all know people who voted the way they did to give Cameron a bloody nose. People didn't really think it would win. They voted the way they did for those sort of reasons. The curry crisis has been mentioned. I was the first person who raised this in the House of Commons to George Osborne when he was Chancellor. At the time, 2 Indian restaurants a week were closing their doors. And I'm daughter of an Indian restaurateur. That is what put the food on the table for me and my siblings when we were kids. It was because of the change in the Tier 2 visas. Basically, it got a lot harder to bring in curry chefs from the subcontinent. You used to have to pay them $18,000. It doubled, which is much higher than the average salary in this country, which is $26,000. So it was one of the... actually, I think I have the flyer here. It was one of the campaign promises of the Leave lot that there we go, #SaveOurCurry. Curry industry on its knees. If we stop EU migration, all these people can come with open arms from the subcontinent. It's not happened. For a brief time in the last Parliament, I was the Shadow Home Affairs Minister. I kept asking, when are they coming? When are they coming? And I was told, no, the target was always tens of thousands. Anyway, sorry, am I waffling on quite a lot?
If you just maybe you've got a minute, maybe just wrap up. Just say something about the second vote, maybe, about the second referendum.
Good question, yes. Look, a combination of a lecturer and a politician, is a bad one for talking bollocks for a long time in front of a microphone. But, so there's a sense of spring in our step and momentum, dangerous word in our party, I know, but small M momentum after the People's Vote March the other day. And I think the numbers went up and up as the day went on. It was 600,000, like Johnny Ball, think of a number, double it, treble it. I think now people are saying 700,000 people on the streets. I think there are very strong democratic arguments, especially if we hit this sort of logjam, impasse, whatever we call it, that if there's no way out of this, if the deal fails, then what next? I think there are very strong democratic arguments for throwing it back to the people. Part of this was that people don't like elites. And arguably it was Cameron and his arrogance and his public school chums that, these kind of people that are capable of taking a... You can imagine they were told, I want something big to win the election on Thursday. But they didn't kind of think long-term about our children and our children's children and all the ramifications this will have. So, I think take it away from 650 MPs, which is what we'll vote on it now, and give it to our population, which is 65 million or whatever. But, I will finish, actually, with an email that I was sent from someone with a very Anglo-Saxon name. I won't name them for data protection reasons. But this is what I got after the march. So it was a mass email. They come now through different tools like 38 Degrees and change.org. So in my office, we usually wait till they've all come in. They're still coming in about that, but we wait till there's a bulk of them. I write a reply. It gets pumped out to everyone. So this is somebody's reply to my reply. Dear Rupert, I'm so glad you're concerned about our withdrawal from the EU. I wondered, however, if you noticed what I noticed the other day at the march. The march, while representing people of all ages and places in the UK, was overwhelmingly white and middle class. I would propose the theory that a pro-Brexit march would be almost exclusively white, but probably probably working upper class with some middle class thrown in. I'm concerned this is not representative of the country. I was wondering whether people of Afro-Caribbean and Asian and South Asian descent were involved, whether they feel more British than European or generally disenfranchised from the whole issue of politics in general. So, this is the $10 million question. Again, I did a similar panel on this recently. and was just was outlining different EU anti-discrimination directives that's got a good record on these things. And then someone in the audience put up their hand and said, I don't feel European. So I think this is what we should talk about in the discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Ruby. Thank you. Well, look, absolutely lots of food for thought. I'm really, really keen to hear from you in the audience, particularly those who voted leave. Thank you very much for coming, because I think it's really important. We obviously have quite a Remainy panel, so it would be quite good for balance to hear, maybe why you voted leave and any kind of thoughts that you have now. Some of the other issues I'm quite keen to draw out from this audience as well. I'm quite keen to hear what you think about this issue about the Commonwealth versus the EU, what we should be doing in terms of having a discussion about immigration, second referendum, the issue about was the Remain campaign too white. I think it's a point that sort of Sunda made, and I think a lot of people agree with that. And Trevor's point about hate crime. I mean, I probably take a slightly different view. I think racism didn't magically go away and just reappear after Brexit, but I think it's given permission to a lot of people. I certainly, on a personal level, have experienced much more racism in the last couple of years than I have done for a long time before that. But you're right, it wasn't like it didn't exist before. So over to you. Could I maybe start with some of are there any of the Leave people that might be prepared to just share with us, why they voted Leave? And sir, we have microphones? Are you a Leaver as well? Yes. Actually, can I start with you and then I'll come to you? Yeah, lady over there. Very keen to hear why you voted Leave and if you have a question.
Yeah, I was in this country in 1975 when we joined the EEA. Mm-hmm. That was what we were told. Economic cooperation area or something like that. Then suddenly, through the back door, we became to where we are now, to the point that they now want to make it a single Europe. Okay. That's one. Can
you speak into the microphone? Yeah.
When I came to this country, you were asked, you make application from your home country, you had the interview, you had everything. Now, people don't want to do that, they just come. Then since we then expanded into the 27 European countries, black people I'm originally from Nigeria, Commonwealth country. They were now being stopped from coming here.
Right.
The MP is talking about curry and things like that. So how can they come? Is it European people that are coming to be chefs, to be making the curry? Okay. No, we were all prevented. So they were now in favor of European countries than ethnic minorities in general.
So for you, it was
I voted Leave.
So for you, it was the disparity between how Commonwealth people are treated and EU people are treated.
And then our sovereignty. Those are the two reasons that made me vote Leave.
Thank you very much. That's very gentleman over there, can I come to you next? Can the microphone, blue shirt up? Yeah, blue shirt up. Yeah, thank you.
Hello?
Hello, hi.
Yeah, hi. I think the main sort of headline point is I'm just not a European. If I describe myself, Basildon-born, bilingual, speak Hindi, Punjabi. I've gladly failed the Tebet test. I support India, die hard in cricket. But fundamentally, I'm just not a European. To the point, I can understand why many people say they're sort of just disinterested. And for me, I mean, it was a whole spectrum of things. Everything from just, the doomsday scenarios of what will happen if we leave to, and I do think there's a sort of an inherent unfairness to the immigration system. Why should my sort of gran have to jump through hoops and invent a birth certificate to come over for my sister's wedding? But, you can have as many car washes as you want down the road at the car wash. As a second generation, I see that, and I think it's just unfair.
So that's unfairness. Okay.
And I can take. I mean, listening to the lady over there, it sounds like how my mum voted as well. She came in the sort of late '60s, and for her, it was
that
great.
lack of
it was Great Britain then, and it will be Great Britain afterwards. It's not going to be diminished because we, exited the EU.
Okay, fantastic. Is there any other levers? Yes, the gentleman next. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think there's a bit. So I'm unlike a lot of other people here. I moved to the country 10 or 11 years ago.
Where did you move from?
From India.
Okay.
And I'm fortunate that I moved here as a highly skilled immigrant and so on. And, this country's been very nice to me. I've been able to make a life here. And I think I can say that for a lot of other Indian people who've come here over the last 10 to 15 years. This country's been very, very hospitable. I've not experienced any racism. It's a great place. That said, the problem is what my friend here and that lady over there spoke about. I think there is an inherent unfairness in the way the immigration system here works.
Okay.
When my wife had to apply to move to this country, she had to pay £1,600 just to get her application in and to get a 2-year visa. We had to renew her visa 6 months ago, and we had to then pay £2,100 to get the new visa. Now, when you stack these things up, and this is just application for a visa, she's a highly skilled person. She landed here, she got a job straight away, and she got a highly paying job. But what I'm trying to say is that when we have to jump through these hoops and you see people coming in for lower paid jobs much more easily, it makes us feel as if we are not wanted in this country.
Fine.
And the fact of the matter is, the immigration policies, the way they are right now.
Okay, so
I just want to make one point.
Just quickly, because we have a lot of other people to get
what
in.
I want to speak, the last thing I wanted to say was, there's been a lot of discussion about Windrush and racism, but why don't the politicians, such as Ms. Rupa over there, ask, why did Theresa May start that hostile immigration policy? Why did Windrush happen? It didn't happen out of the blue. It happened because immigration from the European Union cannot and could not be controlled. So the fact is, a lot of the things that have happened have happened because of that.
Thank you very much. Now, Rupa, I'm going to actually come to you on that. So obviously, and thank you so much for people, because it's very important to make sure this discussion is balanced. And I'm very grateful to hear your views. Clearly, a very strong message is coming over about this disparity in terms of how the immigration rules work. What's your sort of take on that? What do you say back to those people?
I mean, I don't think that was the EU's fault. I think that was our government's fault and its racist immigration policies. And to be honest, there were editorials in both Eastern Eye and The Voice on the eve of the vote recommending people vote Remain. And the reason that The Voice gave was, it wasn't called Windrush scandal in those days, but they were giving the example of a lady who, elderly lady who was being deported, who the EU saved with recourse, all those things we will lose. Recourse to higher courts because we will come out of the European justice system. So perversely, they were giving that as a reason.
Do you accept the frustration that a lot of people feel about this very unequal system of immigration?
Yeah, I do, and I think there's a hierarchy of immigrants as well. I mean, I'm an orphan now. I have no parents. My mother died 2 weeks before polling day in 2017. However, I can hear her sort of saying, "Oh, these Polish people coming to the front of the," that sort of thing. Pressure on school places, those kind of things. But I don't think that was the EU's fault. The fact that the Migration Impact Fund went, the fact that there was a massive miscalculation of the numbers of Poles who would come. I think they were thinking it'd be 13,000 and it was 500,000, and there was no infrastructure to cope with that.
But Trevor, do you want to come in there? What's your take
I just wanted to
this?
say, I don't think that's his point, though. His point is something slightly different, and I have some empathy with this, because I'm on my second marriage, last one, I hope. But anyway, the aunt who brought me up, who at this point would have been 89, couldn't come here to my wedding for exactly the reasons that you gave. But, anybody, my wife's relatives who are Irish, or my children's relatives who are French, could have walked in. And I'm still a Remainer, but I completely and totally understand the point, because it comes back to a point that Sunda made, really, which is that a lot of this vote turned not on the sort of retail politics, but an issue of values. And this fundamentally feels unfair. And for many people from minority communities, it is the sense of unfairness. And I don't agree with you, by the way, that it's not to do with the EU. It is entirely to do with the EU, because we have to be consistent with the EU's immigration policies. If we had anyway, look, the point is that the feeling that he's talking about is not conclusive, but it's a very real one. And I think we oughtn't to sort of just tell people they shouldn't feel like that.
On that, Sundar, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and it came up a lot, and I've certainly, had many people, and I've been travelling around the country saying this to me. But here is the sort of real politics down the track. Given that we heard from, very eloquently from Trevor and yourself about, Aneem and everyone, about how this is actually touching on quite difficult issues about race, identity, 1972, that kind of thing. So a lot of black and Asian people will hope that a post-Brexit world will mean that all our relatives, my cousins from India, they can all come over here easily. Is that what a lot of, to be very crude, white people want in terms of, do you think we are going to get this sudden... Because I don't think that's going to happen. I do not think any future... Well, assuming definitely a Tory politician, no Tory politician, including Sajid Javid, is going to stand up and say, do you know what? Open the doors, everyone come in from the Commonwealth. What do you think?
Well, we've spent the last year doing about 16,000 miles around the country to have this thing we're calling the national conversation on immigration. It's because actually we've lost public confidence at all levels on how we handle immigration. Ethnic minorities are very unhappy about the unfairness. The white British don't feel that we planned for, expected or prepared for the flows that we had. They think governments have taken our eye off the ball. Labour didn't expect that flow. The Conservatives made promises to cut the numbers and didn't keep them. So actually everybody is unhappy about it. We need to rebuild public confidence in immigration and integration in this country. If you don't involve the public, you won't do that. Now, for some reason, 2 years after this vote, they're still ducking it. They'll talk about Canadian trade deals, they'll talk about fish. It's going to be the last topic we get to, because the politicians are still a bit scared, actually. It's become the government's now scared about talking about it, so we need to get on with doing it. If you actually go and do it, I'll tell you what we found most different. If you talk about on the internet, only the people with the strongest views take part in the debate, and everyone else gets out of it. So you get this very polarised debate. You know what we did? And we held conversations with people who engaged with immigration, employers, trade unions, etc., and with citizens representative of 60 towns and cities. You have that conversation. The real world conversation is quite, is quite nuanced, it's quite moderate, and there's a lot of give and take on all sides. First thing we do is say to people, give me a score of 1 out of 10. Has 10 out of 10, has it been the best thing since sliced bread for this country, immigration? 1 out of 10, has it ruined the country? The most common score is 5 or 6. White British average score is 5.5. The Asian average score is 6.5. People are a bit more pro-immigration, but they balance it about differently. You can have a conversation between the 5 out of 10 and the 6 out of 10 people, and everyone else can join in on that. When we did the same thing on the internet, 10,000 people took an open survey. They decided to turn out. Easily the most popular scores were 1 and 10. And so the only people taking part on the internet are the people with very, very strong views. So the immigration debate, actually attitudes towards immigration have got quite a lot softer in the last 2 years. I think people feel more empathetic towards the Europeans. They didn't want them to take it personally. I think the Leave voters feel controls are coming, so they should be sensible controls. So we still need immigration. We've got a chance, I think, to do what we haven't done, which is engage people and talk about it.
That what we'll end up with on immigration will satisfy the needs of, for example, all of us in this audience about wanting to bring is it going to be easier for us to bring people over from the Commonwealth? Do you think
we don't know, because it will be about the overall deal, and that's the bit the government's still ducking. There's a very, very strong consensus. 3/4 of Leavers and 90% of Remainers are in favour of student migration not being cut and skilled migration. There's a consensus on skills from Europe and skills from outside Europe. There is then, people would say, I want to cut low-skilled immigration, semi-skilled immigration, and then if we said, but would you cut it for care homes? They'd say, well, no, I wouldn't, and we'll need some fruit pickers as well. And that's the conversation we need to have, because that's what ministers need to decide. I think people would have controls and let some people in, but I think we would be open to skills. Now, if there's a trade deal on the table, it's a different deal. Then you've got to do that. The British never had a strong European identity. I mean, the ethnic minorities are very like everybody else in Britain in this respect. We didn't join Europe because we felt very European. We actually made a much more transactional deal than all the other countries did. So there's a transactional deal on the table again, which is if you want to be in the single market, you can keep free movement and then that will affect your policy, or there's a chance to say, actually, we want to strike a balance. That's a really difficult choice, but the government should involve the public in it, not think that the public isn't grown up enough to think about that.
Nima, what's your take on this? I mean, certainly having spoken to so many people for your research and things, where do you think this sort of tension comes down between the unfairness, and what do you think people's expectations are?
Well, if I'm being honest, I think that sorry, my voice is going, but I think the Vote Leave campaign had a lot of conflicting messages. So I think to its white British Brexiteer electorate, they were talking about controls on immigration and reducing immigration, and for Black and Asian communities, they were saying, well, it's unfair that Europeans can come here easily, and you should be able to bring people over from the Commonwealth side. I think I'm quite cynical and sceptical about what leaving the EU and stopping freedom of movement means for Commonwealth immigration. I think that Europeans, especially Eastern Europeans, have been stigmatised and racialised in a lot of ways, and have got this new status of being kind of the new interlopers who are taking away British jobs and so on. And I think that if there's a big part of the British public who aren't willing to accept Romanians or Polish or Bulgarians, I think they're less likely to be welcoming to more Black and Asian people from outside the Commonwealth, that's just my view of it. So I think that it's quite patronising of the Leave campaign to have these different messages for different groups of voters, and I think that I think
that's good. So I think, Trevor, you wanted to just come in quickly on something.
Well, just very briefly, somebody who works for me, who lives near Nottingham, told me last week something which surprised me. She said that in an industrial estate near where she lives, they have brought in a lot of Asian tech, mostly guys, I would imagine. And her point, what was she saying to me, is that nobody's bothered by them at all. Nobody's at all disturbed by them. The issue in that area, it's Mansfield, is the large Polish community, which is quite interesting because there's always been a Polish community there, but of course it's expanded rather quickly. I think where we see hostility, it's to do actually with change rather than hostility to particular groups of people. And if I may answer your specific question, what do I think is going to happen? I think we're going to get more of the gentleman up there, who I guess is a tech guy, or something like that. Management consultancy. Yeah, same difference. We're going to get more of you by the tens of thousands, I would think, and there will be no barrier to your access. I suspect the agricultural workers' work visa will change a bit, so it becomes seasonal. I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Although, to be fair, the agricultural people are not tending to come from India or Bangladesh.
No, what I mean is that if we're outside the EU, what we'll probably have is a seasonal visa for people who come from, let's say, Portugal or from Eastern Europe, rather than a single straightforward visa. So I suspect the answer will be there will be more immigrants, but of a very particular type, and that in fact is what happened in Canada, by the way, where in 20 years the composition of the immigrant, the people who are coming in, changed dramatically from people who came from Africa and the Caribbean to people who came from India and the Philippines within 20 years.
Let's see if we're in harmony at that point. So any other questions from the audience? Lovely. Gentleman at the back, and then I'll come to you afterwards, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Oh, is it on? Oh, you might have to project, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks for your. It's very interesting. I didn't neither vote for Leave nor for Net because I'm a European citizen. So I could vote over the last 3 years. I lived in London. I could vote for the main group, but I couldn't vote for.
Oh, I see. Okay. Where are you from, sir? Where are you from originally?
From Sicily.
Oh.
Yes. And I found it very interesting. And in a way, I wanted to ask you just a short question. Because while we were talking about fairness and different different kinds of migration from the European Union or migration from other countries, from the European Union, as a EU citizen, I find it unfair to be considered a migrant as any other migrant from the world. Because I'm not here as a migrant, but I'm here as a citizen of the European Union, and so I'm exercising my rights, and I'm living here as I can live. I lived in Belgium, I lived in Spain, I lived in many other countries in Europe, but I never been called a migrant, because I'm a European Union citizen.
Do you feel that more in this country?
Yes,
than you do in other countries?
I arrived here in the middle of the Brexit debate, and so I couldn't avoid it, but I couldn't but feel like.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But I mean, that makes also made my stay here very interesting, actually. So I cannot. I mean, it's a very interesting experience, but in a way, I find it unfair to be considered a migrant because technically I'm not. I am a European Union citizen, and I'm here exercising some rights. I think that is my question for the floor. That I think that, and from the perspective of a European Union citizen or a European individual, whatever, I think that behind the European Union project, there is also a lot of drive towards overcoming what happened over the last century. Wars, crimes, fascism, Nazism, and perhaps colonialism. I think that, from my point of view, London and Britain are very beautiful places. I love Europe. I am a European and I'm in love with Europe.
Yeah.
So these are very beautiful places. And also London and Britain are very interesting places also for their diversity.
So I'm going to have to actually just be.
Yes, but I think yes, I think that behind all these, like what Brexit means for Brexit, Black and Asian Britain, I mean, one should think also what Britain how Britain has worked. Its own history of colonialism, because if Britain has some difficulty in finding itself European, but I mean, it can have all the difficulty it wants to have, but it is in Europe. I mean, it's Europe, and so it can be difficult, but it's Europe. It's a reality. And so, if Britain has some difficulty in finding itself as a European entity, it is also because perhaps it has had some difficulties in overcoming its colonialism.
It's past. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to crack on and get a couple of questions together. Lady there, yes, I'll come to you next.
Hi, I'm another European person from France. I had a question because we were talking earlier about skilled workers coming to the UK. And I had a question because I got the sense during the Brexit debate that there was a lot of anxiety about skilled workers taking, as it were, British jobs. And I felt like it was this kind of anxiety that was going around. Would you say that this is an idea that's been perpetrated, and do you think that this concern has kept going, that this immigration from skilled workers is taking British?
Yeah.
Do you know
okay. Yeah. No, that's a great question. Yeah. Okay, gentlemen down here at the front. We'll come around to everybody. I'll take them in clumps of 3 because I'm conscious we've got a lot to get through. If you could keep your questions reasonably tight, because I'm just conscious of time.
I think particularly one of the first comments of Trevor's. You're quite right about it not being. It's only a storm in a teacup, Brexit, compared to the storms we'll have to face economically out of tech. But the problem with, and I agree with you, you're dead right. We've got a strong economy, and either way, in or out, we will survive. But I don't think that's the whole point. I don't think it's any of the point, really. Essentially, it's a peace movement. It always was a peace movement. It may have been sold in this country in the 70s as something else, but the economy of it is just the glue that holds the political side together, which is the peace side. It was designed as that, as the Franco-German Coal and Steel Federation. And that's why it's so damn difficult now to extricate ourselves. It's meant to be. We're meant to be forced to stay in, to stay at peace with the other nations in Europe. And to Mr. Cadwally, I think you say that you don't want, you think it would be a bad thing to have another referendum because of the mayhem it would cause on the streets, no doubt. I can't think of a worse reason not to do something that you think is right because you're scared of the outcome. You've just got to bite that bullet. And if we believe that we made a bad mistake, and I do, then we've got to bite that bullet. We've got to go for that referendum, and we've got to fight very hard to win it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. That's a really, really good point. I'm just going to split the questions up, so I'm conscious of time. Sun, did you want to come back to that gentleman, our friend from Sicily, in terms of, his views, and is this a bit of a kickback to our kind of colonial past as well?
I thought it was a brilliantly illuminating question, that, because there's a principled case for freedom of view movement, which you made, and the principled case is Europeans prefer Europeans because we are all citizens of Europe together. And there are 27 other members of the European Union where that's a winning argument. And it's never been a winning argument in Britain because only 15% of people have had a European identity in this country. So the roots of this go back a very, very long way. Brexit starts with Henry VIII, really, because we are European, but we're a European island. And that is a different set of relationships. So people will say, well, it's internal citizen mobility. But the British have never known that we're European citizens. Certainly we've passed treaties, but British identity is much stronger. So I think in a lot of European countries, it's a sort of hybrid between immigration across borders, but you're not really crossing a border at all. And yet, when you come across the Channel, we think, Poles are actually very popular in this country. If you ask people, there's a sense that Poles have been part of our history. Poles flew in the RAF and so on. People don't think immigration was handled well, but there's a contribution to Britain of Polish people. So we welcome them, but welcome Polish migrants. We don't think European citizens. So there's a dialogue of the deaf here, and it's probably the same about peace as well. This country's very committed, I think, to peace and reconciliation in Europe, but we remember the World Wars rather differently. Remembrance as a tradition is very, very powerful in this country, and it very much, I think, should involve Poles as well as Indians and West Indians, because everybody was part of this. But there isn't that same point. I'll just say I don't think it's the right thing to do, because I think leave lost. I think return when we leave is a really democratic project, because leave lost and we'll leave, and if we vote to return, that's great. But I think remain lost, so we should not remain in the European Union.
Nima, do you want to, come in on that in terms of the idea of the second referendum and the...
I just wanted to pick up on the point made by the gentleman from Sicily. For now we are still European citizens as well, but I think what a lot of the other audience members have talked about is the unfairness that comes with being a European citizen, and how you can move a lot more easily within Europe as a European citizen than from those outside. And I think a lot of people do conceive of the European Union as a white men's club that keeps out non-whites and allows freedom of movement for white voters, for white migrants. In terms of a second referendum, I think the polling just hasn't shifted enough, and a lot of people would vote the same way that they voted in 2016, and potentially there might be a marginal Remain victory if we did have another referendum, but I don't think that the opinions of people have shifted enough to warrant another referendum.
Great. Trevor, just to the lady's point over there about this narrative that skilled workers are taking British jobs.
Well, I think all the evidence says that that's probably true, but we're at full employment, and to be honest, I don't think anybody's that bothered about it. All of the polling evidence and so on says that's not what bothers people. We still seem to be missing the point. What is really unsettling people is change. There's I can go on about it, but there's an analysis which you can. There's a website of a company called the Campaign Company. You can go on, you can see it. If you plot change in local authority areas against any indicator, like UKIP vote or views about immigration, what you will find is areas which have high levels of diversity or low levels of diversity but little change, have no anxiety about immigration. Places where they've moved from relatively low levels of immigration to even moderate levels of immigration quickly, UKIP votes sky high. The thing that is unsettling is change.
But
it's
Trevor,
not
when you say change,
hostility.
what do you specifically mean by change? Do you just mean lots of foreigners coming in, lots of different people?
Change in demography, which is why Boston, Lincolnshire, is I think the most Brexit voting constituency in the country, and you can see that it related to demography.
How do you explain the huge, pockets of sort of UKIP support and fear of immigration in areas where there isn't any immigration? How does that...
No, but that's my point. It's not... See, people always make this parallel. It's about the level of immigration. The thing that is driving anxiety isn't the level. It's the degree of change.
But what if there are areas... for example, I went to my friend Gloria De Piero's constituents. There are no foreigners there. There are literally none. And there is this rampant
she's
fear.
Nottinghamshire.
Her constituency has got literally hardly any. In fact, one point, she was saying there was a rumour going around that a whole housing thing was being built and lots of foreigners were coming in. That just wasn't the case. So how do you... Is that just fear of fear itself? Or how do you
I mean, sorry, we haven't really got time to go into detail, but I will bet money that most of the people who live in her constituency don't work there. They work in a place where they're seeing that change happening. I think that, there's endless studies about this, and the work that Matthew Goodwin and Eric Kaufman and so on doing shows it absolutely without any possibility of contest that the thing that drives this anxiety is not levels, which is why you don't have a problem in London. It's not levels of difference, it's the change that's taking place. And that, by the way, if I may just make a couple of very quick points, that, by the way, is why the Germans did not have a problem, because they put vast amounts of money into integration programs, 20 billion euros a year, until the German electorate got absolutely spooked by what was happening in 2015, which was the crossing of the Mediterranean and so on. If I just make a very quick point, I was really very quick. I was very taken by the Sicilian speaker there. All I would say is, if I pitched up in Palermo, I don't think anybody's going to say, regard me as a European, to be frank. And if I may be absolutely honest, I spent a lot of time in the southern part of France, in wine-growing country. Nobody there thinks of themselves as European. They think of themselves as French. And I think this is a sort of rather kind of... This is a view that's taken by people like us, who move easily across different countries because we belong to a sort of elite tribe. People do not think of themselves as Europeans first. They think of themselves as French or Italian or German, and
Sicilian, yes, Sicilian.
It's a good example of what can be a multicultural place, and I mean, it's Europe. It's Europe. But still, it's so near to Tunisia. You feel perhaps nearer to Tunisian people than to France. But this doesn't help. I mean, this is still Europe. That's what
I think.
I think you're both entitled. I think.
I was going to just say. All I was going to say is that actually, we can see how big a deal this is by the most important thing that's happened this week, which is Angela Merkel saying that she's not going to stand again. That's by far and away the most important thing that's happened in Europe, because a point about Germany, I completely agree with you, But the EU's point was not because peace in general. The whole point of the EU was to bind Germany into Europe. And that's why the Germans like Europe, because, frankly, they know that's a way that for 50, 60 years, the German view has been that's the best way to stop the past coming back.
And for good reason, let's be absolutely honest. We do not want, any of us in this room want that horrible past to come back. Rupa, do you want to pick up on some of the points? Also maybe some of the points that Trevor was picking up. I mean, Trevor was basically saying change is the problem. So do we need to be moving to a much more hardline approach on immigration?
I mean, look, I think a sentence on each of these. So your point about the empire. I mean, when I was an academic, I used to write all these things about how, Britain's lost an empire. It's a clapped-out ex-imperial power and it's looking for a role. And now in this, post-European future, that's another whole dimension. I'm hoping we don't ultimately leave. But, I mean, I've got 13,000 EU nationals in my seat. They're all very annoyed everyone's annoyed that they've been left dangling. It's still not clear there'll be fees for this new settled status thing. It's not going to be as good as it is now. You won't be able to vote in European elections. I do think if there's a second referendum, EU people shouldn't be allowed to vote in it. It should be the same franchise. Otherwise, it looks like a complete changing of the goalposts so that you can win the second time round. On the point about skilled migration, I think actually a lot of these things actually are changing. So there's been a budget today. Philip Hammond has announced that there'll be a new passport lane. I can't Google it in here, I'm not getting reception. But Canada, basically a bunch of white countries, white people, will be allowed in quicker passport gates. Was it Japan? Okay, definitely. I heard it sounded like a whole list of rich white kind of countries. Yeah, but not our countries, not our subcontinent, not Bangladesh, not Pakistan, not India, not the Caribbean, not any of those places. So there will be, and I think the way this country does it is often on salary level, not skill level. So there's been some tinkering about by Sajid Javid, but his level is 50,000, which,
No, it's not. No, it's 30, 27. That's just a myth on social media. I mean, it's
No, he announced it. I was there when he announced it.
So,
I mean, a lot of jobs...
tweeting a lot
No,
about
it's everyone believes it. It's complete rubbish. It's the equivalent. It's the liberal equivalent of asylum seekers get a house.
Well,
at the airport.
certainly, that's what I heard him saying when he announced it.
Today, programme made a mistake, and now everybody in academia is making
certainly, I was
mistake.
there when he announced it. So things like nurses, those kind of people would come below that. The point about it keeping the peace. Again, when I was a European candidate in 2004, it just seems like quaint old days that all the script we were given for the doorstep was to argue for the case for Europe, and one of them was that there were two generations of young men, the poppy fields that we are all going to be commemorating next month and all that, was that there were young men ravaged by war and it's kept the peace. That thing seemed to have been a bit lost with all this scaremongering, punishment budgets and Project Fear and all that. And hang on, what's the final thing? Sorry, yes, I think it's austerity is the culprit. That's why a lot of people voted the way they did, not necessarily because they're in a multicultural place, but the ravages of austerity made people vote the way they did. That's honestly what I think.
Okay, now I'm just very conscious of time, so I'm going to take a couple of questions, but you've got to be really, really sharp with your question. So lady at the front, two ladies at the front, and then I'll come up to but be very, very tight with it, and I'm going to be very strict with everyone about answering.
I'll be really fast. Hi, my name's Amina Ali. I'm a councillor here, and I'm also the chair of the Brexit Commission for Tower Council. Just plugging that.
Good plug.
Sorry. And so I'm really interested in looking at our local community, and of course you mentioned the curry restaurants, and of course we did have lots of our Bangladeshi restaurateurs who did vote to leave here because they believed in that hype about immigration. But what I'm interested in is about cohesion. So what do you think about communities like Tower Hamlets, where we have a very large BAME community post-Brexit in terms of cohesion? I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in travel. So after Brexit, people like me who have a very ethnic-sounding Islamic name, Amina Ali, will I get a visa to get to France? Will I have more problems when I get to borders in terms of travel? Have we thought about that for the post as well? And finally, to Sunda, I think with most of the BAME community, it's very hard for us to even look at our identity as Britishness. So the whole question of what is Britishness hasn't been answered properly, let alone another layer of European. So we need to first of all sort out what it means to be British before we even look at what it means to be European.
Excellent, thank you very much. Lady at the front, again, I'm just going to ask people to be very, very brief with her, and I'll come to you.
I voted leave, and one of the reasons I did that was because
believed the thing about the EU never having their audits sort of signed off as being true and fair. What do you guys think about that? Is that a genuine thing to believe, or have I been swindled?
Audit signed off, very good question, very good, precise question. And then gentleman at the back.
I think this is working. Hi, I just wanted to... I work for the People's Vote campaign, so Aisha introduced me on stage in Liverpool.
Oh, yeah, hello.
And I led Rupa and other MPs on our recent march. So I just want to clear up a couple of points, and I had one quick question. So I recently wrote a piece in the Voice newspaper as well, where I was arguing for a People's Vote for the black community, but I've also written in other publications. And I said, if anyone thinks that Nigel Farage would prefer use any Commonwealth country, the one I used in The Voice was a black Jamaican over a white French person, then you're kidding yourself. That's number one. Number two, I just wanted to come back to the point that Trevor made in terms of saying Brexit didn't have an effect on sort of hatred or hate crime and things like that. So during the referendum, we saw Joe Cox, unfortunately, was murdered during that time, and it was a guy who had far right sympathies, but something that was more close to home. So last year we had a terrorist attack in Finsbury Park, and my brother was hit by that van by Darren Osborne. And what I've seen in a personal capacity, like yourself, Aisha, is I think maybe is better reporting, but I feel like people feel legitimized in their hatred towards ethnic minorities. But I know Aisha's going to kill me, so my question is to Trevor and others to say, my main role on the People's Vote campaign is to reach out to, I call it non-traditional media, but let's be very honest, it's to black and Asian communities. So there were many mistakes made in 2016. How can I make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again, please?
Okay, very good. Right, we're going to rattle through those very, very quickly. Sundar, it makes a very, very good point. What is it to be British? And I think quite a lot of this Brexit stuff came from actually, I think, an English national identity crisis. A lot of that, in terms of
I'm very in favour of talking about British identity. We've done that quite a lot. We've talked less about English identity. I mean, ethnic minorities in this country have a slightly higher sense of identification with British identity than average, higher than white British people. You won't find that in other European countries, that the minority population feels more strongly French or Belgian than the rest of the population. That's a story Trevor knows much better than I did. That's the story of Windrush, where a third of people on it have served in the RAF. They know they're British. They've been brought up as British. They arrive in a country that doesn't know that they feel British, and it takes them 2 generations in a way to get back where they thought they started. But I think we've had that debate about British identity, and that's been important, but we've never really had an integration strategy. And I don't, in a way, Brexit might make it harder or easier depending on what happens to the economy, but our integration strategies are about what happens locally and nationally. Just on this issue of the People's Vote, and I thought Rupert made the very interesting point about the, the self-criticism, say it was overwhelmingly white. Where is the heartlands of the People's Vote campaign? It's in the cities, it's in the classrooms, it's in the university towns. I mean, non-white Britons are slightly more likely to be university graduates than the white British. So it's remarkable that a campaign that is heavily located in the most diverse places happens to be less diverse. Well, I think you've got to get out and talk to people and start where they are. I think there's a very big difference between the graduate group. We know that graduates who live in cities are very Remain-based, and it's the ethnic minority younger voters who didn't go to university who still don't know why this is about them. And if you're going to win or lose the referendum, I would concentrate less on the campus, which, graduates of 3-1 Remain. People are graduates, they're largely Remain. I think you've got to go and find out why people have never felt this is about them, and then start the conversation about why you think it should be.
Okay, Nima, just quickly picking up again, this question of the hate, do you think people do feel legitimised in terms of they have permission to say things they probably wouldn't have done before?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with Trevor. I do think that hate crimes and prejudice against anyone who's perceived as not British did go up. If you look at the same proportion of hate crimes the year before, in the same period after the referendum, there was a lot of hate, and a lot of people who voted Leave felt that they were, for racist reasons, felt that they were emboldened after the referendum to take out their frustrations on. And I think a lot of white people who voted to limit immigration have also are fearful of ethnic diversity and increasing ethnic diversity. So I don't think that. I think a lot of the anti-immigration discourses do affect Black and Asian people very negatively, in that we're still perceived as immigrants even when we're British-born. And my voice is going. So
okay, no, that's Trevor. Just in terms of Amina's point about, you know, what do we do about this kind of, you know, this cohesion element, particularly in an area like, you know, Tower Hamlets, which is so diverse, and actually, you know, it's been very much besmirched. I mean, Rod Little wrote a horrible thing about Tower Hamlets just last week. How do we bring people back together?
Well, I think that. I mean, it's brief, you have to give a brief answer on this. I think that a fundamental problem at the moment, I think Sunda referred to this in passing, is that we conduct an immigration debate in rather abstract terms about numbers, which, frankly, nobody knows. I mean, none of us actually knows in our daily life whether there's 10 million immigrants coming into the country or 10. What we do know is that our neighbourhoods may change, there are different names on the shops and so on. And I think where the Germans were completely right is that they just invested very, very heavily in making the process of change less onerous where it happened. They put a lot of money into cities, they put a lot of money into housing, they put a lot of money into language tuition so people could get into the labour market and so on. And we haven't even begun to have that conversation. So, you know, boroughs like Tower Hamlets aren't literally, we're not even counting the change in the population in boroughs like Tower Hamlets and Slough properly. That's really what we should be dealing with. Can I just make a very quick point in relation? I sort of understand what you're saying about the issue of the hostility, but let me be absolutely precise. There is actually no evidence for an increase in actual racial violance.
But hate crimes have gone up.
No, they haven't. Not in.
They have in my borough.
Well, we can go on. We can go on about this, but I spend a lot of time buried in this.
Yeah, as do we all.
Can I just finish? Can I just finish on it? What you could say, and I agree with the way you expressed it, is that people may feel freer to say some of the things that they have in their heads. Now, you then have to have a proper conversation about whether you think that is really a bad thing, whether you think it is better for somebody to hide what they feel, but still then make it impossible for you, for example, to have a job, or to know what they are. I know which side of that debate I come down on, but the question, the real issue you raised is one about racial violence. And the reason I'm picking this up is that I think we need to be really careful about deploying argument around somebody's death in this kind of conversation.
I think to be fair, the gentleman has got very close experience of it because his brother was.
I get all of that. I get all of that. It
was an anti-Muslim attack.
I get all of that, but I think we have to just be really careful about how we do this.
Rupa, the audit question, that is a very useful question.
So, I mean, look, I think part of where... So, yeah, as I said, there are democratic deficits within the EU, as is. Part of the problem where we went wrong is also David Cameron's phony renegotiation. So he went, he got nothing really, and he was pretending it was better than what we had. I think if you stay in, that's when you can sort of improve things because you're part of it. If you're outside, then you can't. So, I mean, that's what I'd say to that. To Amina's point on travel, which I think no one's answered, my son came home with a school trip letter about Berlin, and because it's after March the 29th, there's a whole paragraph that says, in case of a no-deal Brexit, there may be additional costs because of the fluctuations of the pound. There may be visa fees. And if we don't get a renewal of the Open Skies Agreement, the plane may not take off. I mean, because we don't know who's going to regulate the airspace on March the 31st, the other side of all this. So, I mean, again, there's so many of these unknown unknowns. What I would say is we should negotiate a longer Article 50, and then there is going to be a demographic tipping point, actually, when the scales will rebalance, kind of thing. If we say
I mean, basically the point is none of us going to America. That's for sure. Like you and I both not getting into America. Which now I'm just I'm just conscious of time. I think we're going to have to. If we got time, Have we got time for some more questions, or is there anyone from the organising team here? Okay, we'll just do a quick round of questions, but very quickly. A lady at the back, but your question has to be really, really, really short. And then I want to ask you all a question at the end, which is very important.
Evening, everyone, and thank you for taking my one question. One's to Rupa, thank you. My name is Valerie, and I'm from Islington North CLP. The manifesto. If we do leave, we have to, how are we going to deliver on our manifesto, especially in terms of freedom of movement, which we've been very quiet on. And my issue, obviously, is in terms of, the lady mentioned about the Commonwealth. I've got many friends and family who are not just from the Windrush situation, but also from Africa. And we haven't mentioned about them who came here, and we just talk about Windrush and the Caribbean community, but we've got a lot of Africans that have been hurt by this as well. And then my last question is to Sir. I read your booklet, and it was really interesting. Actually, I made loads of notes, key notes. And Sunda, I wanted to ask you, in terms of when you get your information, how are you actually accessing it? Because I don't think some of it kind of relates to maybe people within my own community that have experienced what the gentleman talked about, which is hate crime. And we do have a many number of women who are not actually reporting it. 2 weeks ago, I actually experienced my first incident of hate crime, and I've lived in the UK. I was born here, but I actually wore my head wrap because I am African, and I actually think it's because I had my head wrap on that actually I was targeted. So I hear what you're saying, Sir Trevor, but I think it is on the rise, and there's a lot of issues that we need to address as a country. Thank you.
That's great. And then just gentlemen here in the middle with scarf, but please be very, very brief with your question because we are really, really short on time, and then I'll take one other question afterwards.
Yeah, just really briefly to Sir Trevor Phillips. I'm not sure about the German case being quite as cosy as you suggest, particularly with regard to Turkish immigration in Germany. There's a long history of Turkish immigrants not necessarily receiving this great utopia that you're talking about. And Mesut Özil, for example, I mean, that is a very, very strong case where perhaps Germany might have something to learn from the UK, I don't know, but Germany isn't necessarily the panacea that you describe.
Okay, very good. And then lady at the front here with the glasses. Thank you, that was a very short question. Again, very brief question, please.
Yeah, we've had a lot of talk about how many people think what, but we haven't talked that much about what influences what people think. And I think in this country for decades, there's been a sustained campaign in the tabloid media against immigrants, and that influences what people think and how they feel. And on the day of the Brexit vote, I went to my local news store and I looked at all the tabloids, and every single one of them had loads of brown faces saying, "Don't let them in. Get out before they come in." So that affects how people think. So although we're doing all this polling and we have to now respond to how people, their concerns by changing our stance on immigration, maybe we should look deeper at our institutions in this country. I think that's really key.
Excellent. Okay, so Ruth, I'm going to come to you first. Lady at the top, what is Labour? How does Labour reconcile its manifesto commitments and everything with freedom of movement?
Yeah, so I mean, look, this manifesto is going to be very difficult to implement because every government scenario, every sector, every region of the country, their own analysis shows that we will be worse off with every model of Brexit, hard Brexit, soft Brexit, whatever. So, I mean, our policy is that we have these 6 tests, and at the end of that, if it doesn't happen, then we don't vote for it. And then we're in an unknown sort of, again, scenario. And I think in that case, that's when I think, because there are increasing numbers of Conservatives also coming around to the idea of a people's vote. On that march, there were people like Dominic
But just on that, just to clarify, what is Labour's position on freedom of movement?
So I think, look, I mean, what we're doing...
Is there freedom of movement with the position?
There is a flowchart of doom first before we even get there.
OK, that's right. Then Sunda, responding to the lady at the top, she didn't feel that some of your report reflected her own lived experience.
Well, I think there are 60 million lived experiences in this country, and there are 5 million different experiences being black, Asian, and mixed race, and they're all important. I think what was interesting about also what changes people's opinions. So we spent a lot of time in the West Midlands in the first 3 months this year talking to people about Enoch Powell, and it was the 50th anniversary of that speech coming up. Is that what people felt now? And what did people feel now? And if they didn't, why had attitudes changed? It was really interesting. She had a visceral sense of that moment. If you were over 65 and you were in this country when Enoch Powell made that speech, you still remembered exactly how it felt. And if you were white British, you had a really lived sense of how it had changed across the generations and so on. And then when we talked to 18 to 24-year-olds in Wolverhampton, just no one had ever heard of him. And it was the seat he was from. And it turned out, we polled it, 75% of ethnic minority people in this country have not heard of Enoch Powell, because people under 50 haven't heard of him, and people over 50, it dominated their lives. That's a really interesting generational change. That meant that older people had this really clear sense of how it had changed for the better, even though it wasn't perfect. Cyril Regis, the footballer, had just died. And people say, if you look at what he faced and what he did. And young people, it was really interesting, they didn't feel it had changed for the better, even though actually it had, because it wasn't interesting to them to be told, if there's prejudice after Brexit, that it might be worse in France, or you should have seen what the NF were like in the 1970s, because although things had changed for the better, their expectations had changed faster. And they did not expect to put up with the things their grandparents and parents took up with. So I thought their refusal to say it had changed for the better, and if you're Muslim, actually, it probably hasn't changed for the better, it's probably got worse, was actually a really positive sign that people expect absolute equality. But we've got to... What really matters is personal contact, and when people have personal contact, it trumps what they see on the internet and read in the newspapers. Where we met people who didn't have personal contact, they just spouted things off the internet. And so build personal contact. And people think the thing that has made most difference to race relations in this country over the last 50 years is that people met in schools, in workplaces, and where that happened, that went quite well.
And just conscious of your very, very quickly, Trevor, to this lady's point here, how do we sometimes change the institutionalised image of, the migrant, the other, from our friends in the more right-wing section of the tabloid press? And there is some truth that there has been a drip of quite negative stories.
OK. If I may just quickly respond to the gentleman here, I wasn't actually saying Germany got it solved. All I was really trying to show was they have ploughed a lot of thought and a lot of energy and huge amounts of money into trying to solve what, exactly as you say, a big problem. And we haven't even got to that stage. Never mind solving. In relation to the lady's point over here, well, I see what you're saying about tabloids, and in general, yeah, of course, it coarsens the discourse. But as someone who does write periodically for the worst tabloid, what I can say is...
They pay really well.
They pay really well. What I can say is they're nowhere near as influential as we on the left would like to think they are. And one of the things you need to understand about us journalists is that basically we're cowards and we follow rather than lead. And almost every piece of academic research on the influence of tabloids will tell you that this kind of stuff follows the reader rather than the reader following it. So my point here, and this is a fundamental point, I do not want anybody to walk out of here thinking that what I've been saying on the race and violence question is, it's all right, it's not happening. My objection is the supposition that this happened because of Brexit. It's the same as, I spent a lot of time in the United States, people saying, what's happening in the United States is happening because of Trump. Actually, in my view, exactly the reverse is the case. These are symptoms of something which has existed and which people have actually felt and experienced long before 2016 and will continue to experience. And if we start saying, if we get rid of Trump or if we deal with Brexit, these things will go away, we are just kidding ourselves.
I think, Nima, final word from you on this.
I would agree that racism existed before the referendum, but the nature of the debate was so toxic, and especially the rhetoric on immigration. I think we can't ignore that it was a very polarizing referendum campaign, and I think that a lot of people who do hold racist views feel vindicated by the referendum result and felt that a majority of the population agree with them. I do think that hate crimes have gone up, and because of the referendum, for those reasons. And I do think that the media has a responsibility to report fairly. I don't think it's just the newspapers following opinion. I think they're very important in shaping the agenda and how we interpret the world around us. Yeah, sorry.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you all so much for coming. I just want to ask a couple of quick questions before I go. So, who here would, if there was a second referendum, who would change their vote? What would you change from to? You would vote leave?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And just the other question I want to say, who here would like to see, hang on 2 minutes, who here would like to see, feel comfortable about a proper debate on immigration, which kind of, who feels that discussion has been stifled? Who would like to see a proper, sane discussion on immigration? Okay. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you all so much for coming. You've been a fantastic audience, really engaged, and please give a big warm applause to all the lovely guests. Thank you.